Welcome to Alastair Mordey's presentation. By far the presenter that I learned probably the most from his succinct, very informed, modern and open way of teaching. And I wish there were more like Alastair Mordey, actually. So I'm really pleased you're here this afternoon. You're in for a treat. Ali is the co-founder of the Cabin Addiction Service Group. I always get muddled up with the name because it sort of varies a bit. But I would actually, when I think about him, I think of him as somebody that is prevalent in the UK, and I'm proud that he is a UK professional, and we need you here more often. Part of the reason, though, I'm willing to accept that he hasn't been around and hasn't been presenting so much is because he's been writing a book. And I think we're on the final chapter, or in fact we've finished. I'm not sure if there'll be anything about that this afternoon, but for me, I'm really looking forward to doing it. He's an exceptional individual, and I'm very pleased to introduce him. Alastair Mordey.
Thanks, Sam. It'll be a difficult act to follow. Okay, I hope I live up to it. My name's Alastair. My friends call me Ali. As Sam mentioned, I'm the program director of the Cabin, which is headquartered in northern Thailand, in Chiang Mai. So some of you will know me, some of you won't. Those of you who have seen me speak before, I've spoken on a range of subjects, from the neuroscience of reward through to how to use Muay Thai boxing for young men with addiction and trauma issues, which sounds like a crazy idea, but believe me, it works. All sorts of things that I talk about, but this time I've chosen something a little bit different because of, obviously, topical issues that are occurring at the moment. And opioids have a long story in Asia where we're based. So that's partly why I picked this topic, is because of our location and a resurgence of opium cultivation in Golden Triangle, which lends to quite a nice story for this presentation. And we'll fill in some of the blanks. We hear a lot about the US epidemic, opiate epidemic. There's a lot going on in Asia as well, particularly in China. Hopefully you'll pick up some facts that you probably don't know somewhere around the middle of this presentation about what's going on in the greater Mekong sub-region, which is Thailand, Cambodia, Burma, and also in China, and that has ramifications for America because there's a lot of importation going on from China. The harm reduction and abstinence bit comes from my journey, really, and obviously we talk about it a lot. You'll have heard a lot about both of those models since you've been here in these few days, and they're often at loggerheads. And there's good reasons for that, because they are very different. They can be bridged to an extent. My background is quite indicative of this. So I've been in the field for 15 years, and the first half of it, approximately, I worked in harm reduction end of it. And then latterly, the last 7 or 8 years, I've been in abstinence-orientated treatment, obviously running a large treatment centre in Thailand. So I started out in street outreach about for any Americans or North Americans in here, that doesn't mean marketing, okay? Outreach doesn't mean marketing. It means walking around on the streets, getting street drinkers and injecting drug users and crack cocaine users into some kind of services, or at least street outreach means that, and that's what I did. That's how I started in Haringey, which is about 7 or 8 miles north of here. For those of you who are non-Londoners, you'd probably be more familiar with Tottenham, which is one of the areas within Haringey. It's a notorious borough in London, a strong competitor for most deprived borough. Lots of gang activity, lots of heroin and crack cocaine addiction, lots of street alcoholism. And that's how I started. I was one of the only people in recovery in that service, because oftentimes in harm reduction services like methadone clinics, street outreach projects, needle exchange programs, a lot of your colleagues are not in recovery, which is okay, sometimes. Sometimes it has had issues for me. And then at the other end of the spectrum, once I started running my own private treatment centre, almost all of the counsellors and staff are in recovery themselves and have equal prejudice sometimes against people that aren't in recovery, professionals and colleagues who aren't in recovery. So I've seen it from both angles, if you like. Okay. Quick thing about terminology. So traditionally we tend to talk about opiates. If you want to be nitpicking about it, an opiate is really one of the alkaloids that's found in the opium plant. So morphine, codeine, thebaine. Probably a better catch-all term to use these days, or a term which people seem to be using more and more, is opioid, which is good as an overall term because it includes any opium-like substance, but also our endogenous opioids that are within the brain and that activate opioid receptors in the brain and body. So that's probably the term that we should be using, but we all know what we mean when we talk about opiates or opioid. I will probably use the word opioid. Okay, so if you've seen me talk before, you'll know that a lot of people who present talk about the individual, or they talk about the family, or they talk about trauma, and I'm down with all of that, but I like to look at it from a cultural level or a societal level. So I look at society or our culture like an organism, and I look at what's happening when it's sick, the same way that we tend to look at what's happening when the individual is sick or when the family's sick. I take it one level out and look at what's happening when society is not well. So that's going to be a theme that's going to run through this whole talk. It always runs through all of my talks, because that's the level that I'm looking at. So whilst practitioners now are telling us don't look at the individual, look at the family and look at the trauma in the family, I'm saying no, look at the intergenerational trauma. They'll go that far. Look at the intergenerational trauma. Yeah, well, what is that? That's our society. That's our culture. So I'm going to bring everything ultimately back to that level. And drug use, opium use, has been around for a very long time. Our Paleolithic ancestors, so that's our Stone Age forebears, used drugs. They licked toads, they ate peyote buttons, they had mushroom cults, they brewed vines into concoctions that gave them hallucinogenic visions, and we would say that they did all of those things in a sacred manner. So those drugs were what we would call entheogens. So does anybody know what an entheogen is? Literal translation. And then the literal translation would be generating God within. So what it usually means in common parlance is a drug like mushrooms, magic mushrooms, that have a spiritual or sacred aura to them when you take them. So it's kind of this intimation that you're not really abusing them or using them recreationally. They have some kind of religious overtones. And that's how we romantically think about our Stone Age ancestors, our Paleolithic ancestors from more than 12,000 years ago. We know that they were using drugs, but most likely they were probably getting stoned as well. They were probably just lying around getting stoned because we like feeling pleasured. Once we get into the Neolithic era, so that's from 10,000 BCE onwards, or what you might call the agricultural era. So the Neolithic revolution is synonymous with the agricultural revolution. So at some point beginning around 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years BCE, civilizations, so-called, started to arise in strange pockets of the world, disparate pockets of the world that didn't seem to be connected with each other. In Central America, in the Near East, in China, all at the same time. It's like something just turned on in the human brain, and we ceased, all of us anyway, being hunter-gatherers, and some people started to settle and they formed what we call civilizations, and agriculture was a big part of that. And as a result of that, we could cultivate crops, some of which were opium, and of course wheat and crops like that we then had the time to produce alcohol from and so on, and drug use becomes a lot more ordered, as this statuette proves. So this is from Crete, from the Minoan culture, about 5,000 years ago, and this narcotics goddess was found with a pipe. So we know that it's probably recreational. I mean, that hat, let's face it, looks more like something you'd see at Glastonbury Festival than what a priest would be wearing, right? So, in fact, I found another photo of Bez from the Happy Mondays. It's even got the same hand signals. There's something going on. And this is as old as the hills. You know, is it sacred? Is it recreational? Is there as much of a boundary between the two as we think there is? That's where I go with it, is who's to say that heroin use in Glasgow doesn't have some kind of sacred element to it? So we know this has been around for a long, long time. Humans have been getting stoned and getting themselves out of their boredom, meaninglessness, or perhaps they were seeking something even greater. Their society was quite stable, but they were searching for something. Say goodbye to Bez. So the Minoan culture that statuette came from informed the Greek civilization, which obviously has then been a massive influence on Western civilization. And you'll see poppy imagery all the way through the Greek myths. So the Greek gods of sleep, night and death respectively are often wreathed in poppies. Gods that you'll be even more familiar with, even those of you who didn't study classics, are often depicted in association with poppies. So Apollo, roughly synonymous with the sun god, or Jesus, quite similar to Jesus. Asclepius is god of healing, roughly speaking, so the rod of Asclepius is still the symbol of physicians everywhere, with the snake wrapped around it. Pluto, god of the underworld, or the depths. In Jungian psychology, particularly with regard to addiction, we'd think of the underworld as somewhere you go down into, especially if you're a young hero, and you go through horrendous trials and then you ascend again wiser. So you can work out the associations there that might have with addiction. That might be an addict's journey. Hermes, or Mercury, is a god of Odyssey, so a similar thing. Somebody who's going on a difficult journey and is going to become wiser when they come out the other side. So I think that's Hermes there with the winged helmet and wreathed in poppies. And it carries on and on, all the way through the Western literary canon. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Kubla Khan, Lord Byron, De Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater. Conan Doyle, obviously his main character was Sherlock Holmes, who's a notorious sometime morphine addict. It's there in the work of Dickens, Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, and even The Wizard of Oz. So modernity, though, is where we start to see things really, really change. And this is where our, or my interest in looking at it from an Asian perspective comes from. The first Opium War was really the first, eventually it became, I would argue, the thing that caused the emergence of the first narco-terrorists. So some of you will know about the Opium War. The British predominantly, also the Portuguese, but British traders went to China, loaded up their ships with porcelain and tea, brought it back, and then went back empty-handed, which was really annoying them. So they took matters into their own hands and began to sell opium illegally in Chinese ports. So there was no two-way trade agreement between the West and China, and some people would say some things never change. The Donald, as we call him, is still scratching his head around that one today. You know, we can't work this thing out with China, but back in the day, that was simple to solve. We just forced it upon them, and the next thing you know, there's a large-scale conflict, which the British won and opened up concessions in China and started to sell opium. So the British and the Portuguese and other European powers got obviously a bad reputation because of this. If you go into any one of the opium museums in northern Thailand or eastern Burma, there are museums, government-funded museums. There's one in just outside Chiang Rai in northern Thailand that is dedicated to telling the social history of the Golden Triangle area. It's like a shrine to opium eradication, which is a little bit of propaganda, but it's actually quite truthful, a lot of it. They also have them in eastern Burma. So during the 1990s, Thailand in particular began to get on top of its opium production, and as part of showing how good it was to the Western powers and the sort of US-led war on drugs, they erected these opium cultivation museums to show everyone the history. And in that history, the British feature very, very badly indeed. And that's partly true and partly not true. The facts are that China was ruled by the Qing dynasty, otherwise known as the Manchus, and it was a horrible society in many, many ways. It was extremely unequal. There was incredible poverty, and people were getting seriously fed up, and opium use was already beginning. So it's a combination of things. It's a combination of an incredibly unequal society with millions and millions of people who are living in poverty and are very unhappy, with modernity closing in, and industrialization and the free market coming in, and foreigners are at the gate, kind of thing. So times are changing, and they're changing rapidly. So this is what sociologists would call a state of catastrophic social anomie. So anomie means things are changing so fast you can't keep up with them. And it wasn't just China, it was the Highlands of Scotland, it was First Nations in North America. So it wasn't that sheep farmers in Scotland and native tribesmen in North America and Chinese rice farmers didn't have values. They had values, but those values couldn't keep up with where society was going. And this is something you need to hold in your mind now as we go through this talk, because this has got ramifications for where we are now. History is repeating itself. So when times change so fast, think Rust Belt, think industrial, think factory towns closing down. When times change so fast, people's value systems can't keep up. They might be good value systems, but they don't really fit anymore. And the society goes into a catastrophic state of social anomie and chaos. And that, I would argue, is where addiction worms its way in. And there's a writer who some of you might know called Bruce Alexander, who calls this the social dislocation model. Who's read Bruce Alexander? Right, great, because he's Canadian, right. So Bruce Alexander, you'll know these writers though. Who's read Gabor Mate's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts? Like, yeah, about a third of the crowd. And Johann Hari's Chasing the Scream. Yeah, these are bestsellers. They're much better known. Well, Bruce Alexander was a big influence on those books. So he's a much more low-flying psychologist who also works in Vancouver, I think. And he did Rat Park. He did the Rat Park experiment, right? So Rat Park was where he proved that if you actually made a rat cage that had rat stuff in it, rat toys and, you know, girl rats as well as boy rats and nice things, pleasurable opportunities, they didn't like cocaine as much as when they were in an horrible empty cage. And the ramifications of that were that he was trying to show that when vets came back from Vietnam, they didn't remain addicted if they went into a socially stable situation. So that's why he calls it the social dislocation model. So when humans are socially dislocated, they get addicted. So hold that model in your mind. Things got worse. There was another opium war. The nationalists, there were two big forces at work. So bear with me, because we're talking about China, but this will become global shortly. So the nationalists and the communists were at it, and there were lots of other factions. The nationalists forced the imperial dynasty, the royal family, if you like, to form a constitutional government and declare China a republic. Then there was a hugely chaotic era called the warlord era, during which all factions were dealing in opium. So they were all narco-terrorists, effectively. Apart from the communists seemed to do it less. And I'm no communist, believe me, right? If you know me, you know I'm no raving lefty. But it seems that the communists were not as involved. The nationalists were much more involved in trafficking opium to fund their arms. But ultimately, the communists won that one. Mao Zedong came into power, and the nationalists fled over into Thailand and the mountainous regions of Burma and Thailand. So I think you can see where this is going to go. Within 3 or 4 years, allegedly, the communist regime had brought opium use, which by now is up to 5% of the population. 20% of Chinese who are living in a war-torn country are abusing opium, some 20 million people. Allegedly, within 4 years, by 1953, according to Bruce Alexander, that was down to virtually zero. So why is that? Bruce Alexander argues that the Chinese communist system was very different to the Soviet communist system. So the Soviet communist system was very industrial. It was all based around the factory. It was quite alienating, actually. Maoist communism was based around the farm and the village collective. It was a collective, it's a very Asian vision, a very collectivist vision of society. So people came together. The fact that it eventually was an absolute economic disaster and caused famine doesn't stop the fact that initially it probably did create much more psychosocial integration, much more socially located people who were in family units and clan units or village units, and the emphasis was not on industry. All the industry they had was cottage industry, and that was a disaster as well. But initially it reduced addiction rates, according to Bruce Alexander. Other less liberally minded people have suggested that Mao just shot everybody, which is also quite likely. He probably did execute the bigger dealers, and a lot of addicts who were recidivist went into labour camps called Laogai. So somewhere in between there we've got the truth, which is that there were enforcement policies used which were very nasty and which are still happening in the region as a very ham-fisted method of dealing with addiction epidemics, but also some kind of collectivist vision of society seemed to have a considerable impact on how many people wanted to medicate themselves with a strong opioid. Right, so keep all of this in your head, because obviously we're coming to the current situation eventually. It's worth noting that there are some clues that Mao may well have practiced extreme enforcement, because this is a policy which has kind of lived on in the region. Thaksin Shinawatra, who was the Prime Minister of Thailand in the 2000s, was responsible for a lot of extrajudicial killings, and a lot of people in Thailand know somebody, often somebody who was innocent, who was murdered by the police during that period. And Rodrigo Duterte's crackdown is still ongoing in the Philippines, and it's probably been 10 to 20,000 odd extrajudicial killings, and obviously isn't working. I mean, that goes without saying. So back to the point about those nationalists who ran away from the communists in China. They fled to Taiwan, where they still are to this day, and they also fled across the border into Thailand, where they still are today, and in northern Burma. And they joined with lots of refugee ethnic minority groups that were already there, who had come in previous generations, getting chased out of China by the Qing dynasty. And they moulded together in an unholy alliance of paramilitaries and soldiers whose main cash crop became opium. And you had the first mass opium growing phenomena that the world's ever seen, and it flooded Western markets with high-grade heroin in the 1970s and 80s, mostly consolidated under the auspices of one man, who was a drug lord called Kun Sa, who figures heavily in these opium museums. When you go in there, you'll see little statues of Kun Sa, just like that, sitting there. And so you, up here on the top right, you have an ethnic minority, and I think that's a Hmong woman cultivating opium. And a lot of the ethnic groups have paramilitary groups. They're not really under the control of the Burmese government, the Thai government, or anybody. It's chaos. So that's the first example of narco-terrorism, really. And at its height, the Golden Triangle supplied most of the world, up until the late 1990s. And then something happened. Thailand's late king, King Bhumibol is actually the pronunciation, was quite a remarkable man, actually. He died 2 years ago. He basically eradicated opium cultivation in Thailand. It's the only really successful example of this. He did it by crop substitution, by encouraging coffee plantations and so on. He didn't do it by enforcement. This was before Thaksin Shinawatra. He did it by having all of his extended family got very involved. The Queen got very involved. And I think what it probably, nobody can quite work out exactly how it works, but this is the feeling, is that the Thai hill tribes, who are not Thais, had an extreme feeling of, what's the word, loyalty to the king, because Thailand had always tolerated them as refugees coming into the northern regions. And that when they were asked to stand down growing opium, at least in northern Thailand, they did switch to growing coffee, or they ran across the border into Burma if they decided to carry on. And Thailand's more or less eradicated opium cultivation. It's all gone into Burma or Laos in what we call a balloon effect. So when you grab a balloon in one part, it gets bigger in another part. So it doesn't solve the situation, it's just solved the situation in Thailand. And part of that balloon effect was that the Golden Triangle was no longer the main producing region in the world. The Golden Crescent arose, and you can't quite see it from there, but have a guess where the Golden Crescent is. Afghanistan, Pakistan, for similar reasons. Call it narco-terrorism, paramilitaries, raising money for arms, whatever you want to call it. The gap in the market was there. So around the mid-2000s, the Golden Triangle area, cultivation of opium went down, but it's now resurgent again. And the king's died now, and that's partly to do with it, no doubt. And a lot of this opium cultivation is feeding domestic demand, particularly in China. So once again, the amount of opioid addicts in China is rising very, very sharply. That problem probably dwarfs the American problem, but we don't hear anything about it. A lot of these opium products are then turned into fentanyl, basically, which is then imported across to the States. And this is a real big problem for the United States, dealing with the fentanyl that's coming across from China, who no doubt aren't particularly that bothered about stopping it, you know, as long as it's leaving their country. So here we are, once again back to business. So where are we? In the States. A lot of this I took from seeing James Flowers talk last year at Breakers. He's presenting tomorrow, I think. He's in the room. He's not in the room, but I've cited him down here. So I saw Dr. James talk with Louise Stanger last year. He's a pain expert. So a lot of these middle bullet points come directly from James Flowers. Morphine's first isolated by Friedrich Sertürner in early 19th century. I think I'm right in saying it's the first time someone managed to isolate a chemical compound directly from a plant. Are there any chemists in the room that can contradict me on that? I think that's right. And then the hypodermic syringe is invented a couple of decades later. And then you have the American Civil War, which was very, very brutal and very bloody. So the American Civil War and certain drug legalization advocates these days do not like this argument, okay? But the argument is that the American Civil War and the aftermath was the first opioid epidemic in the United States. It seems to be pretty damn obvious if you think about it. You've got a really bloody good painkiller, you've got hypodermic needles for the first time, and you've got tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of men with seriously traumatic injuries, because you've got a lot more ballistic weaponry than you've ever had before, and you've got a lot more amputations than you've ever had before. So this is where morphine really got going on the battlefield. And then just think about all the trauma. After civil wars are seriously traumatic. brother against brother. The trauma that's come, the psychological trauma, never mind the physical trauma that's coming out of that war in the 1890s is across the whole family, across the whole of society. So when opioids are hitting the shops and they're available over the counter, and diamorphine's making its first appearance at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the early 20th century as well, as a really good medicine for coughs. Heroin is the best cough medicine ever, bar none, and you can get it over the counter, and you've got a whole nation where brothers have been murdering brothers. It stands to reason that a lot of people were self-medicating. A lot of that addiction, yes, was iatrogenic, caused by a medical procedure. So somebody's in pain, they take opioid painkillers, they get addicted. Iatrogenic addiction. Circumstantial addiction or trauma, self-medicating addiction, and no doubt partly because of aggressive marketing by the big pharma of the day. So it's not necessarily like Gabor Mate or Johann Hari in particular might have us believe. This is how the sort of extremely, what's the word, liberal mindset of Johann Hari works. It's all a conspiracy theory. Drugs should all be legalized. There was a nasty man called Harry Anslinger, who probably was really nasty, who was the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the guy who wrote Reefer Madness, or had Reefer Madness produced. You know that crazy cartoon where everyone's going crazy from smoking dope? Yeah, he was responsible for that. And they were silly. They didn't understand drugs, and they didn't understand that prohibiting drugs wouldn't work. But they had an opioid epidemic on their hands, and they didn't know what to do about it, and they weren't very sophisticated, and so they banned it all, of course. But what people like Johann Hari are saying in Chasing the Scream is that none of this was true, and this all retrospective propaganda to justify the global war on drugs that Harry Anslinger then built, which, to be fair, has been a massive disaster. But the real truth is probably somewhere in the middle. We're in a very difficult situation, didn't know what to do, we didn't know what we know now, and opioids were either controlled or outlawed early in the 20th century. It's worth saying that there is something to that argument. A lot of Chinese labourers, interestingly, were at this point building railroads in America, and they were smoking a lot of opium. So what it looks like is that it's a bit of a racist piece of legislation. And that might be true too. But all of these things are in the mix. So now where are we? History kind of repeating itself. In the 90s, Big Pharma, specifically Purdue, began aggressive marketing strategies to promote a new generation of opioids, oxycodone, hydrocodone, as analgesics, as painkillers. Oxycodone, or the products that come out of it, like OxyContin, was said to be less addictive than existing opioid analgesics like diamorphine and morphine. They funded what was arguably biased research into pain management protocols in an attempt to manipulate the way that we, the public, and doctors and the medical establishment thought about pain and thought about opioids. They appear to have wanted to explicitly change the way we think about those things and make us more liberal and open in our patience around taking potent drugs. Doctors came under an increasing pressure to prescribe them. They were handed out pain scale charts with a lovely big smiley face at this end and a horrible red, bulgy, angry, sad face at that end, and you were asked to point at which one you were, and if you pointed at this one, hey presto, you just scored some gear. And it became really, really easy, arguably, to get hold of opioid pain meds in the early 2000s. Pain was seriously being discussed in academic circles as being the fifth vital sign. There's 4 vital signs. and doctors were threatened with being sued for leaving patients in pain. So imagine you're a doctor. They're in a really, really difficult place. What do? They've got litigious big pharma at one end of the stick. They've got whingy, whining patients like us at the other end of the stick, and probably lots of addicts too. What do? They capitulated a lot of the time. Of course they did. But what we know now from the literature, that's just one study at the bottom, but there are many, is that overuse of opioids actually increases your perception of pain. That's a condition known as hyperalgesia. So what better analogy is there for our society's woes than hyperalgesia? Think about it. We're the least traumatized generation that ever lived. You wouldn't think it if you came to a conference like this, but we are. We are the most comfortable generation that ever lived. The 20th century saw the least deaths amongst men from violence of any century, with 2 world wars. In prehistory, most of us men would have died from what? A hole in the skull. At least if you listen to Steven Pinker, who's not wacky. You know, Steven Pinker is a right down the line evolutionary psychologist. So most men in prehistory died of violence. 20th century was the least violent century. So the less pain we're in, the more pain we think we're in. The more comfortable we are, the less comfortable we feel. The more we have, the less we feel like we have. It's a perfect analogy for the condition that we're in. More than 64,000 Americans died of opioids in 2016. These are ASAM's figures, American Society of Addiction Medicine. Drug overdose leading cause of preventable death under the age of 50. More than 2 million Americans dependent on painkillers. That's more people using painkillers than tobacco. And just to put it in context, these are previous epidemics, if you like, epidemics of gun deaths, road deaths and HIV-related deaths. It way tops all of those figures. This was a New York Times report. So in the mid-90s, when HIV was claiming a lot of lives, 40,000 people died of HIV-related illnesses in 1995. Well, this is getting on for double that. And I added this slide because I read this last weekend. It's from an article in The Guardian, in the Society section of The Guardian, if any of you want to find it online. And I think you can get this PowerPoint from Sam. I think they're going to put it up on the website. But the UK is getting there. We have brown towns. We call them that because most of the heroin in the UK is brown. Most of the towns are coastal. 8 out of the top 10 are coastal. They're not even big towns. You know, there might be quite small towns that you never really heard of. Barrow-in-Furness is a good example. This might not sound like a big figure to North Americans in the room, but 12 drug-related deaths in the first few months of 2018. So it's on track to really break a lot of records. And Barrow-in-Furness used to be a town of heavy industry, used to make things for the Ministry of Defence. It doesn't anymore. In the UK, we don't really have a rust belt. We have like a rust archipelago. We have little islands of rust. So whereas in the US you have a great big thing down, what was it, from Chicago down through Detroit, and just huge areas of heavy industry that have gone, and guess what? Lots of addiction, and lots of what particular kind of addiction? Yes, opioid addiction, because people are looking for meaning and purpose. All drugs of abuse and all behaviours that we use to pleasure ourselves inordinately trigger our brain's dopaminergic system, firstly, which everybody tends to think of as our reward system, but which I tend to call our meaning-making system. I think it's a better way of phrasing it. It doesn't matter which drug you're using, you're self-medicating on a dopaminergic level. So you're recruiting reward, which in real terms is felt as meaning and purpose. So a lot of addictive pursuits, when they're consummated, they're not enjoyable. So ask an experienced heroin addict veteran what even the actual act of using is like, it's not that great. It's a bit of an anticlimax. Actually, it's best when you're going to get the gear. So the best thing is, you pick up the phone, ring, 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 and you say, oh, God. And then they answer. That's great. You get a little dopamine slug when they answer. But then you're still nervous because you don't know if he's got anything. So then you say, have you got any gear? And he says, yes. Another little dopamine slug. Can I come round? Yes. Okay, you're going. But you're not feeling that comfortable because drug dealers have nasty habits like just leaving and not telling you where they're going. And then you knock on the door and he opens the door. And that is the best hit that you're going to get when you're an experienced heroin addict. It's all downhill from there. Yeah. Of course, yeah. But it's quick. It's quickly downhill. Now, the high point is really when you know you're going to get it, right? When you're thinking of pleasure. Yeah, and pleasure has got nothing to do with it. Yeah. Yes. That's what's addicting us, right? So it's not the pleasure that's addicting you, because most of the time you're in a state of terrible unenjoyment, right? So the reward system has little hedonic hotspots where you feel pleasure. Think about it. When you're eating, it's not pleasurable all the way through, is it? It starts out pleasurable, and then it gets less pleasurable as you get full. So most of the reward system is about the meaning of what you're doing. I'm eating to stay alive. And it's studied with little moments of pleasure to keep you going, to reach that goal. So what's underlying it is, what I do is I go and get heroin and that makes my life meaningful. What I do is I eat food because that keeps me alive. All the things, it's all survival based. All of our addictions are survival based. So the lad in Barrow in Furness who is going to get some heroin is engaging in a survival behaviour. It's the meaning contained in the going and getting the heroin and doing the heroin and being in that group of people and feeling like he has meaning and purpose that's driving him to do it, not the pleasure from the rush of the heroin. It looks like it is because it is so pleasurable most of the time, not really. It gets worse as you get older, or it gets less good, shall we say. So that makes sense if you think about it. People that are in these towns, in these situations, within a culture that's changing rapidly and doesn't have the meaning systems and the value systems that it used to have, is going to find an alternative source of meaning. Yeah? And in the UK, we have towns scattered here and there that are affected in that way. In the US, they have huge swathes of the countryside that are affected in that way. But the common denominator is that what used to be of value and meaning has disappeared quickly. And an alternative source of meaning and purpose will be anything that activates your mesolimbic dopamine system. Yeah.
Why post-op?
They're just really depressing. Good question. Don't know. They're particularly affected by the economic downturn, you know, and a lot of them are shipbuilding areas, ports.
Lack of employment.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. Yes, absolutely. And with that goes your value system. Who am I? What am I doing? Yeah, I'm a member of a gang. What's pleasurable today is that I'm going to get stoned, and I know what I'm doing. I know what I have to do. I have to go and graft, and then get some money, and then go and use. I know what I'm doing. Sorted.
Was Scotland included in that bit? Do you know?
Don't know. Can't remember. I tried to get the map on there and failed due to being a tech idiot. Yeah.
Glasgow is included.
No, because the amount of people in Glasgow is a big city.
Yeah.
So in Barrow, there's even more people per head that are using heroin than in Glasgow.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's massive.
Yeah. Look, 12 deaths. It's only 67,000 people there. Okay, so now we get to the second bit of it, which is harm reduction versus abstinence. Issues in treatment. Do we reduce harm? Do we ask people to become abstinent? Most of you will know this, but for those of you who don't, we'll go through it. Withdrawing from opioids is not dangerous per se. There are complicating factors you get. We used to get them before we really got on top of it in the early days in Thailand when we had literally had cabins because of the humid conditions, and people used to get sometimes get lung complications. But in general, withdrawing from opioids is not dangerous in the way that withdrawing quickly from alcohol or benzodiazepines would be, where you can fit and die. So the most dangerous thing with opioid withdrawal is getting clean. If you get clean for a significant amount of time, if you become abstinent for a significant amount of time, your tolerance lowers, and if you relapse, Judith Landau keeps nagging me about using the word relapse. If you have a reoccurrence, then you might die if it's too potent and you're not ready for it, and you will have respiratory failure and you will die. So getting clean is more dangerous than the withdrawal. And this has led to a lot of discussion about what should we do. And Hazelden, that a lot of you will know that Hazelden is a flagship, or was a flagship of abstinence-orientated treatment in the States. In 2012, they changed their policies because of a spate of deaths post-treatment, especially amongst young people, right? So if you think heavy industries leaving the States, culture's changing and values are changing quickly. We don't know who we are. Young men in particular, let's say, don't know what they're going to be or who they are or what's going on. Opiates fill that nicely because, like any drug, they pump your brain's meaning system and make you feel meaningful. Even if you're doing something that's stupid, it makes you feel meaningful because it's giving you a dopamine slug. And the opioids are giving you a warm, bonded, belonging feeling. Right, so that's wiping through the industrial areas, and you've got a lot of under 30-year-olds, particularly young men, going into treatment, and at the same time, treatment duration is coming down because of insurers won't pay anymore for long-term treatment, or even cash payers haven't got as much cash because the economy is not so good. And the treatment duration has gone from 3 months down to 28 days, and more opioid addicts are coming in, and more of them are under 30. And we know that under 25-year-olds in particular don't always make great decisions, right? So what we're looking at is too short a time period for young people in particular to be able to get a potent dopamine hit from being in recovery, from being part of a recovery tribe. That takes time. You can't necessarily do it in 28 days. It might take 3 months for you to start to understand, say, 12-step principles.
I think it takes a month
Yeah.
for your brain chemicals for homeostasis to happen anyway.
Right, well, a year even. So 3 months might be good as a start, right? But no, a lot of the treatment episodes will be coming down to 28 days. So then people are leaving. Now you can do it, we'll go into this in the next few slides, but you need something else in place. So if that isn't in place, and you've got a young person, massively lowered tolerance for opiates, and out they go, use again and die. So Hazelden said, well, we're going to have to rethink this. And they brought in maintenance therapy for the first time. So in other words, they started to use Suboxone whilst the person was in treatment, with a view to the person not being abstinent when they discharged. So that was a massive change. This is now harm reduction, arguably, not abstinence-orientated treatment, right? Because they had to, for safety reasons. Right. Let's really get into the nuts and bolts of it now. Harm reduction, abstinence. These are my definitions, working definitions. Harm reduction has the aim of minimizing unnecessary suffering. Remember that word, unnecessary suffering. I believe there's such a thing as necessary suffering, right? I'll come back to it. Maximize safety and stabilize the person's drug use so they're safe. Sounds like a lovely, lovely thing. What could possibly be wrong? It's just such a lovely thought to have and such a caring way to be. And often it is, and sometimes it isn't. Abstinence has the aim of removing all mind-altering substances on the basis that all such agents keep the disease alive. That sounds really judgmental and a bit harsh and all of those things. And it's not necessarily. It might be a lot of love contained in that message. Harm reduction, the common modalities of the street outreach that I talked about. Abstinence-orientated practitioners wouldn't often practice street outreach because we work on the basis of attraction rather than promotion. We work on the basis that you can't help somebody that doesn't want to be helped themselves. And I've actually changed my views on that to a considerable extent. I'm an abstinence-orientated practitioner who's come to believe that's not strictly true. So if you listen to people like Nora Volkow, the president of NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse, who are very 12-step friendly, very abstinence friendly research scientists. And they say treatment doesn't have to be voluntary to be effective. As Judith Landau teaches, who's been training people over the last few weeks, you can bring the bottom up to meet the person instead of waiting, because their rock bottom might be their death. So over the years, I've mellowed with that one. But in general, abstinence-orientated practitioners won't be going out and beating the streets and trying to find people and going, I want to save you and I want to help you. Please get clean. They won't be doing that. They're waiting for them to get ready and get into a teachable place and present for treatment. Needle exchange programs are part of the sort of outreach that I would have done. Again, let's imagine trying to explain to somebody who's more conservative in their opinions what a needle exchange is. The average gun-toting, tobacco-chewing, tax-evading Midwestern Republican, right? And it would go something like this. What's a needle exchange? Well, it's a place where you get clean needles. What for? Help addicts inject drugs safely. What? You mean you give addicts needles to help them do drugs? Yeah. Why'd you do that then? Stop them getting bloodborne viruses? It's their problem, isn't it? Well, I suppose so, but we're not sociopaths. Yeah, our society has a strongly ingrained pillar of helping others when they can't make sensible decisions. It's part of the Hippocratic Oath, our healing tradition. We don't operate like that. So unless you're really going to take that argument down to its ultimate conclusion, what would you say to him? What, you're going to prevent people from coming to accident and emergency with gunshot wounds? He'd probably say, yeah, that's their problem. Take it further, what, you're going to stop people having medications for heart disease because they've been eating too much ice cream their whole life? I mean, how far are you going to take that argument? So most people would agree that needle exchanges are an indubitable force for good. There's nothing bad about them. You know, even if you're an abstinence-orientated practitioner, you probably agree they're necessary. When you get down to maintenance therapy, it gets a lot more complicated, a lot more controversial. So when I worked in outreach, the next door clinic was a methadone clinic. In the States, they often use Suboxone to the same effect. So part of the harm reduction policies that are predominant and have always been predominant in Europe, Australia, Canada, works around maintenance therapy, as opposed to the States, which has a preponderance of abstinence-orientated treatment. Agonist drugs are used. What's an agonist or a partial agonist is something that's to some extent mimicking the effect of the drug, but in a controlled environment. So methadone will quell the cravings of a heroin addict, obviously, but not quite such an euphoric way, and as prescribed by a physician and in a controlled environment. So arguably safer. Then again, and this would be my argument, is it's based on a ludicrously naive view of what the disease is. This is what I always used to argue anyway. So let's say, which addict have you ever met that went to their dealer and said, hello dealer, I'd like to get some slightly less good drugs today, please. Have you got any slightly safer and less enjoyable drugs? Just give me not quite enough to get high. Could you do that? It's not how the disease works, and me and Brian had a conversation about this, and it's somewhat different. There's some research that I want to show you in a bit of how that can work, and if it's going to work, you want to be prescribing a therapeutic dose. So giving the person enough methadone to make them feel well, and that's arguably what we often didn't do in the UK. We'd titrate people down, so they're just enough to quell the cravings, but it wasn't enough to give them a hit. And if you're going to heal addiction by giving them something that mimics the hit, then give them enough. Right?
Also, it's got the longest, most horrible withdrawal.
Yes, and it's got long-term.
It goes on for months. If you've been prescribed a big script, then it can take 6 months to sleep normally after
Right.
a methadone.
So I've got this on pros and cons in a minute.
Coming off heroin's quite quick
Yeah,
compared to juice.
you're a couple of slides ahead of me.
Yeah.
Use of blockers is another way, so antagonist drugs that effectively neutralize the action of the opioid, which again, you might argue, theoretically that shouldn't work. Why? given what I told you about what I think about the neurochemistry. Because you're not addicted to the drug that you're addicted to. What? You're addicted to the brain dope. You're addicted to reinforcing or upregulating your midbrain dopamine zone. And you can do that via a range of drugs or behaviors. So this is what people find with addiction. It's a bit like the global war on drugs. It has a balloon effect. So you squash one addiction here, and it's like playing whack-a-mole, and it comes up here, and then you whack one down. So you get rid of the heroin, then the sex comes, and you whack down the sex, and then the food comes, and you whack that down, and then the cigarettes come back, and then you whack that down, and you're all emotionally crazy. And that's addiction, because what you're looking for is a hit of meaning and reward and belonging and bonding and attachment and goals and purpose, and that's all dopaminergic stuff. So you're not really arguably addicted to heroin, for example. You're addicted to raising your midbrain dopamine tone. You might be dependent on heroin as well, which is complicating it, but they are not the same thing. So addiction and dependence are not the same thing. So think about it. I use my inappropriate analogy that Jorgen and Brian are probably like so bored of hearing, and I'm going, oh God, not the kidnap analogy. So I take you're a good non-addict. Okay, you've no history of addiction. And I take another person who has a history of addiction, your friend. He's currently abstinent. I kidnap you, I take you to my cellar, I tie you up, I inject you with heroin for 2 solid weeks. I release you. You run away screaming. Where do you go? Police station first. Make a witness statement. You've been kidnapped. It's taking a long time. You're going into withdrawal, both of you, because you're both physically dependent on heroin. Right? Even the non-addict is physically dependent because he's been getting injected with high-grade heroin for 2 weeks. He's given a witness statement and is feeling a bit ill. Your next plan, both of you, is to go to the hospital to get some detox meds and feel more comfortable. He's happy to sit through the witness statement. You've gone into the toilet to break out of the window. It's taking too long. You don't want to go to the hospital because you think the drugs they have there will be rubbish. You're craving. You've got all sorts of imagistic stuff going on in your head. You've got all sorts of emotional cravings to go back and do what? Before you're out the window, you're running back to my house. Your kidnapper. Knock, knock, knock. Could I have some more heroin, please? That's what addiction does. It will tell you're still proofed against shame. You will do whatever it takes. It comes on you before you realize it. It is imagistic. So it builds pictures in your head about what you should do to solve the situation. Addiction is characterized by cravings and mental phenomena like that, not by physical dependence. There are plenty of people out there today who are physically dependent on a drug, who if we wean them off that drug, they will no longer act out addictively. Right? So that's why I say blockers on their own won't work, because you're just trying to block something and they'll find another way of getting it, because it wasn't that drug in and of itself that they wanted in the first place. Abstinence. So most main modalities with abstinence are 12-step mutual aid groups, and then the way that 12-step principles are put into institutions, which we usually call 12-step facilitation or Minnesota model. And you also have therapeutic communities, which aren't so in vogue these days, but back in the day, before Narcotics Anonymous in the 1950s, there used to be quite a vibrant TC model in the States. There's one particular one called Lexington Narcotics Farm in Kentucky that used to take a lot of black jazz musicians in particular. And its modalities were basically farm work and enjoying being outside, art therapy, and some kind of slightly bogus type of detox via sedatives. And it was quite shame-inducing, as it still is. If you go into a TC now, they still have them all over the world in bizarre places. And it's often quite shame-inducing, based around confrontational therapy and stuff like that. The group turning on an individual that isn't following the rules, and it's robust and quite hardcore. It can work, but that's abstinence-orientated as well.
So could you comment on the use of naltrexone implants?
Yeah.
Only before I was listening to a lecture on dual diagnosis.
Yeah.
and certainly in Worcestershire,
Mm.
the psychiatrist wouldn't see anybody if they were on drugs.
Right,
You had to be clear of the drugs, and then eventually they might get round to seeing you.
right, right.
So I think leastways with naltrexone implants, you
Yeah.
get somebody off drugs, keep them off drugs
Mm.
until the psychiatrist would sort of,
Mm.
give them the benefit of their time.
Yeah.
So, is there a role for naltrexone?
Yeah, can be. A lot of the people I work with, particularly, there are a number of abstinence-orientated people that I work with that prefer blockers like naltrexone to agonists like methadone. There are also, though, people who cut out their own implants with a scalpel. And if it's in your abdomen, you have to be pretty motivated to do that. Why would you do that?
So you can use it.
So you could use again. So it's pretty potent then, the desire to use again, right? Yeah. Therein lies the problem. You're not solving the problem. You're trying to put something in the way that will deter the person, but that in a lot of cases won't deter them. Because
This doesn't give them a better chance of solving the problem if they're free.
yes, it might do, depending. I'd say it would come down to assessment and individuals. So you look at the individual and how many social skills they've got, what their support network's like. Are they likely to be the sort of person who'll try and cut out their implant with a scalpel? And if not, they're ready for a naltrexone implant to get them to the next stage. So it's a good question, because there's no either or here, it's both and most of the time. So pros and cons of harm reduction. Lots of overdoses and health problems from methadone in particular. Long-term health consequences not that dissimilar to any other opioid. Compliance is often poor. That has been a lot in the UK. I think actually in the US, even though it's used less, often the protocols are better and the dose is more therapeutic and people are more compliant by the looks of it, from the figures I've seen anyway. It's philosophically unpalatable to some people, so it's basically state-sponsored soma. So does anybody get the literary reference there? Soma is the drug that's taken in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. So Brave New World is a dystopian London, where every citizen takes a cocktail of soma, which is morphine and cocaine. And if you don't like to take it, and the main protagonist in the book, Bernard Marx, doesn't like to take his soma, he's not a good citizen, and he's well sus. Nobody likes him, they think he's really suspicious. He also doesn't like to be promiscuous, and the norm in that society is that there's no love or one-on-one monogamy. You're a weirdo if you do that. You should be promiscuous. And he doesn't like that either. So he's sober and miserable, but he's not damping down his emotions with soma. He's seeing reality, and that's, for me, the message of the book. Doesn't matter that he's in pain, that he's angry, he's seeing reality. And people who don't like harm reduction philosophically might feel the same way about methadone. You're not getting a full emotional range. You may not be seeing reality. And certainly if you followed like a Buddhist ethic, like a lot of the people that come to our centres are quite interested not only in the 12-step perspective and abstinence, but also in what Buddhism and Vipassana meditation has to offer people in recovery. That would certainly fit with the Pali Canon or the teachings of Buddha. Is the first thing that you're doing when you're doing Vipassana meditation is screening your body for sensations. And the sensations are the first signs of true reality. Right, so when I'm doing Vipassana, I can tell you now, I've been doing Vipassana all winter again. I've got a kind of resurgent energy for meditating. So I get up at 6, I do half an hour of meditation, Vipassana style, and I do a body scan. So I'm going from the tip of the toe to the top of the head, sometimes each bit of skin as big as a postage stamp. And trying to feel that bit of skin and see it and feel it. And then I move up, and then I move up, and I move up. And I can tell you, my fridge has 3 different sounds. And if I phone up the manufacturer, I bet you they'll tell me, yes, there are 3 components that make a sound. I know the reality of my fridge. Because when you start to tune in, you start to see the actual reality of what's around you. The true reality, not the bogus reality. So that would be the same argument for if you are clunked up with a chemical compound, it might be stopping you from seeing reality. And that might be an issue. It might not, but it might be. So it might be philosophically incompatible. The pros of harm reduction is less fatalities. It takes the black market out to a considerable degree, reduces BBVs, bloodborne viruses, by as much as 33%, and a reduction in crime, which some would say was the whole reason methadone was brought in the first place. It wasn't a caring measure, it was brought in to reduce crime, not to save lives. That's a bit of a cynical view, and not one I accord to, but pros and cons of abstinence. As I mentioned, there's a heightened risk of OD, post-treatment or post-leaving prison. There's reoccurrence of comorbid factors like depression. When you stop using, you might, it's a bit whack-a-mole again, you might find your depressive symptoms come up. But again, the argument I was just making, perhaps better to see it for what it is, and then treat that for what it is. So is it best to not be able to see the depression that you were unwittingly medicating with your addiction? Perhaps it's best to become abstinent and then see the depression and deal with the depression as depression. Don't know. Well, I do know. I know what my view is, but successful maintenance programs kind of work like this, according to McClellan. Thanks, Dr. Bryan, for reminding me of this. A therapeutic dose would be a good start. So giving the person enough to actually quell the cravings properly. A wraparound program that actually increases social bonding whilst the person's in maintenance therapy, which is just like somebody who is abstinent. One-on-one therapy, group therapy, perhaps even some occupational therapy, art, working, doing things like that. And having a key worker, perhaps a special, not a special relationship, but a relationship that means more to you through that period, somebody that you can talk to and count on and that coordinates you and makes sure that you get to your meetings. Here's a success story of abstinence, which I really love. So Iran, it's just so bizarre. It's such a crazy thing. In Iran, there are more NA meetings than in the rest of the world, apart from in the States. In the rest of the world combined.
Can't they get nicked
Yes.
though for going?
There have, yeah, there's been some issues with that. But in general, no, because, I mean, yeah. And this insane fact, the Iranian government considers NA to be its most important NGO, which I just think is amazing. And it looks like the Iranian fellowship is kind of more working its program even than the American fellowship, because there are more key tags that get picked up per head. So that when they're getting in, they're staying in. Why is that? If you think about Iranian society compared to American society, why once they got into that group would they stay more readily?
Family.
They've got more of their culture is still more intact. So go back to Bruce Alexander's theory of social dislocation. They're less socially disconnected than we are. Significantly. They are a modern society, but extended family is still extremely important. So they're more familiar with being a little unit within a whole. They're more collectivist. And I would say also their religion is more intact. Now, you don't have to sort of be religious to sort of freak out on this one, but let's say 12-step programs are a spiritual dimension to your life. Iranians are probably, I would argue, more likely to have a spiritual dimension to their life already, or to be open to it, or to be more familiar with it, or to be less shocked when they're confronted by it, or something like that. It feels easier to them to walk into NA and talk and hear about higher power and how they're not important, and how it's about sublimating yourself to the greater good and handing over your will. They'll get with that probably a bit easier than the average Westerner. Right, so now we get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Can these two things come together? Well, according to World Service Board, Narcotics Anonymous, yes they can, but under certain conditions. So here's the thing that people that are on methadone feel like when they're going to go to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. So you've got somebody who's been in a harm reduction program, who's now going to go and avail themselves of an abstinence-orientated mutual aid group. And that mutual aid group might not be, but might be full of people who are not sure whether that person belongs in there, and that person might not be sure whether they belong in there. So the person who's on methadone is, am I clean? You know, and is everybody else going to think that I'm clean? Usually, in my experience, most NA members are cool. You know, some aren't. That used to be more the case, not so much now. But here's the actual directive. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop using. That's why you can get in the room. So if you're on methadone, you can get in the room. You can go to an NA meeting. Don't let anybody tell you you can't.
And most people would be very supportive.
They absolutely would.
Say keep coming.
Keep coming back is exactly what they say.
Challenge them that actually they're not clean on methadone, but if they keep coming, they will be one day. And they might not like that.
Here we go.
There are new meetings now for methadone, people that are
Methadone Anonymous.
Yeah, and I think it's called MARA.
Right.
But
So,
it's not Narcotics Anonymous.
no, separate fellowship.
They have their own group now.
But you're quite right. NA members reassured us that this was not the case, and we were encouraged to keep coming back. But
I would say with the methadone group, where's their hope there? Because if
I'll take your questions at the end, yeah? Let's do a Q&A at the end, so let's keep the flow going. So, but, to answer your question, but, does NA have the right to limit their participation? Yes, it does, according to this bulletin. So this is the technicalities of it. They may come, but it's advised that they participate by listening. And then if they want to talk after, one-on-one, to another member. So that's the directive. I have no opinion on it. That's the directive, which you could say that doesn't sound too appealing, thanks. I'm not sure I feel at home there if you're on methadone. But the reality is, of course, individual NA meetings might allow them to share. So that's how it is.
I've never seen an NA meeting where anyone has been refused to share because they're on methadone.
Yeah.
I've always, in newcomers' time, people can share drunk out of it on methadone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that to me is,
Yeah.
it might be the directive, but it's not what happens.
Yeah.
In
I think, well, what the argument is if they keep, say there was a methadone clinic next door, and before you knew it, you had 30 of the 40 people in the rooms were on methadone, and that was every day of the week, yeah? Then what you would have is, the argument is the message of what is recovery might get diluted. So in that situation, then you might ask for the people who've got more clean time to be more vocal, something like that, yeah? Okay, so seriously opioid addicted, this is my suggestion or protocol. This is what I do. This is going back to Hazelden and what their changes in policy were to keep people safe but to still protect abstinence-orientated principles, right? So ideally, serious opioid addicted individuals shouldn't really be pointed to abstinence-orientated treatment unless there's enough time to do so. Right, so if you're going to, so perhaps what we shouldn't be saying is, yeah, your son will be, I know he's been using heroin for, you know, in extremely high doses, he's a very high risk user, he's been using for a long time, and yeah, we can sort it in 28 days, don't worry about it. What aftercare services are, oh yeah, well he can go to NA meetings. That might not be, the NA meetings might be fine, but we probably shouldn't be saying that we can deal with a long-term chronic heroin user, might have multiple relapses, reoccurrences, multiple treatment episodes, and pretending we can do it in 28 days just because that's the way that treatment has now gone. Perhaps we should be saying no, well, we think it should be 90 days. Or, if it's 28 days, we'd like them to go on a 12-month monitoring program. Or, are the people who are there on the other side, do they have Narcan capabilities? What is the plan? And the reason for that is that it takes time, like we said, to instill. If you're going to instill abstinence-orientated principles, 12-step principles takes time. It takes time for people to get socially connected, and before it starts to act as a potent dopamine agonist in itself, yeah, the social bonding. And it will happen, it just takes time. Okay, so where it's not possible, you could look to doing what Hazelden did. You look to discharging still on an opioid substitution medication. And you use a thing called the three-circle plan. So this is what I do in that situation. I treat a maintenance client like they were process addicted. So do you know what I mean when I say process addicted? They have a process addiction or a behavioral addiction. So sex and food would be good examples of potent dopamine agonists that people get addicted to, but that they can't abstain from, and nobody would ask them to. So if you had a chronic sex addict, you would not be prescribing abstinence for a chronic sex addict. Unlikely, in most cases. You would still be allowing them to have sex with their partner, and you'd be outlawing, as it were, all the other addictive modes of their sexuality. And when sex addicts are in treatment or in mutual aid groups, they do a thing called a three-circle plan. In SLA, we might call it top and bottom lines. So the inner circle, that red zone there, or the bottom line, is what defines your abstinence. So that would be any sex outside of marriage, outside of my particular relationship for the sex addict. For drug and alcohol addicts who are in AA or NA, that would be all mind-altering drugs. That's our abstinence criteria. When we take a drink, we've lost our sober time. When we smoke a joint, even if we're a heroin addict, we lost our clean time, right? So for the sex addict, that would be as soon as I use pornography. Because porn and all the other illicit activities outside of sex, outside of the marriage, are a breach of his sexual sobriety. So he may have sex with partner and masturbation. That's okay. Maybe not the masturbation even. And that's his abstinence criteria. If he masturbates, he's no longer clean. He's no longer sexually sober. He's lost his time. He goes into SAA meeting and says, I'm one day sexually sober. I lost my sobriety on Monday night. I masturbated, if it's a men's meeting. Okay, so you can do this with maintenance clients. People are on methadone. Whereas the heroin addict who's gone abstinent has all mind-altering drugs in his active zone. That's what tells him if he's actively addicted, using any drug. The same is true for the heroin addict on methadone maintenance, apart from his prescribed dose. So his breach of his clean time is using any illicit drug or using more than his prescribed dose. And this is a dynamic plan. So as he tapers off his methadone, those abstinence criteria rise. So it goes from 120 mil to 100 mil to 80 mil and so on. Does that make sense? So that is, here is a traditional abstinence. This might be a heroin addict who is completely abstinent and in NA. He's not using any mind-altering drugs. That includes any legally prescribed opioids. Nothing. His recovery is NA, family therapy, meditation, and probably a huge range of other things. His boundary behaviours are things that are going to take him back to active addiction. So if he doesn't do his recovery behaviours, he winds up in boundary behaviours. And before too long, he winds up in active behaviours. So boundary behaviours don't lose you your clean time. They tell you that you will be losing your clean time very soon if you don't go back into the recovery behaviours. And they are emotional triggers as well as drug-using triggers, people, places, things, but also internal states and moods. Oh, pretty much spot on. And here is the maintenance client. So he's only different in his active zone. He can't use any mind-altering drugs, but he also can't exceed his maintenance dose. As long as he takes his dose, he's clean. Yeah? His recovery behaviours might involve some other mutual aid groups as well as NA. He might like to do SMART, he might like to do Dharma punks or Against the Stream, or rational recovery. It's advised he doesn't share, but he could check his group and maybe they don't mind, and he finds that he can share there quite happily. And his boundary behaviours are the same as the other guys, but he might add to that missing meetings at the methadone clinic, etc. And that, ladies and gents, is it. And that is all I have by way of social media.